Far from being an inert dumping ground for excess calories, fat tissues operates as a reserve energy supply for the body. Its calories are called upon when glucose is running low, that is, between meals or during fasts and famines. Fat takes instruction from insulin, the hormone responsible for regulating blood sugar. Refined carbohydrates break down at speed into glucose into the blood, prompting the pancreas to produce insulin. When insulin levels rise, fat tissue gets a signal to suck energy out of the blood and to stop releasing it. So when insulin stays high for unnaturally long periods of time, a person gains weight, gets hungrier and feels fatigued. Then we blame them for being fat. But as Gary Taubes puts it, obese people are not fat because they're overeating or sedentary. They're overeating and sedentary because they're fat and getting fatter, and that's making them more tired. Ludwig makes clear, as Taubes does, that this is not a new theory. John Yudkin would have recognized it, but an old one that has been galvanized by new evidence. What is not mentioned is the role the supporters of the fat hypothesis have played historically in demolishing the credibility of those who propose it. In 1972, the same year John Yudkin, our hero, published Pure, White, and Deadly, a Cornell-trained cardiologist named Robert Atkins published the Dr. Atkins Diet Revolution. Their arguments shared a premise that carbohydrates are more dangerous to our health than fat, though they differed in particulars. Yudkin focused on the evils of one carbohydrate in particular and didn't explicitly recommend a high-fat diet. Atkins argued that a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet was the only viable route to weight loss. Perhaps the most important difference between the books was tone. Yudkin's was cool, polite, and reasonable, which reflected his temperament. He's also an Englishman. And the fact that he saw himself as a scientist first and a clinician second. Atkins, resolutely a practitioner rather than an academic, was unbound by gentlemanly conventions. He declared himself furious that he'd been duped by medical scientists. Unsurprisingly, this attack enraged the nutritional establishment, which hit back hard. Atkins was labeled a fraud, a quack. His diet was a fad, and it was a successful campaign. As even today, Atkins' name brings with it the odor of quackery. A fad, quote unquote, implies something newfangled, but low-carb, high-fat diets have been popular for well over a century before Atkins and were, until the 1960s, a method for weight loss endorsed by mainstream science. By the start of the 1970s, that had changed. Researchers interested in the effects of sugar and complex carbohydrates on obesity only had to look at what happened to the most senior nutritionist in the UK, John Yudkin, to see that pursuing such a line of inquiry was a terrible career move. Yudkin's scientific research, their reputation had all been sunk. He found himself uninvited from international conferences on nutrition. Research journals refused his papers. He was talked about by fellow scientists as an eccentric, a lone obsessive. Eventually, he became a scare story. Sheldon Reiser, one of the few researchers to continue working on the effects of refined carbohydrates and sugars throughout the 70s, told Gary Taubes in 2011 that Yudkin was so discredited, he was ridiculed in such a way, and anyone who said something bad about sucrose, sugar, they'd say, oh, you're just like Yudkin. Essentially, you're an idiot, or you're an eccentric, you're a quack. If Yudkin was ridiculed, Atkins was a hate figure. Only in the last few years has it become acceptable to study the effects of Atkins-type diets. In 2014, a trial funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, remember the NIH was predominantly staffed with Ancel Keys followers for sure for many, many, many years. And again, going back to the Max Planck theorem, once those guys die off, it opens up a new thought process, which is what's going on. So the NIH allowed itself now to have some other opinions. All right, so the trial funded by the NIH, National Institute of Health, 150 men and women were assigned a diet for 1 year which limited either the amount of fat or carbs they could eat, but not the calories. By the end of the year, the people on the low-carb, high-fat diet had lost 8 pounds more on average than the low-fat group. They were also more likely to lose weight from fat tissue. The low-fat group lost some weight too, but it came from the muscles. So high carbs, low fat, you lost a little bit of weight. You lost 8 less pounds than the high fat, low carb, and your weight loss came from muscle. High fat, low carb, you lost 8 more pounds than the low fat, high carb, and your weight loss came from fat, not from muscle. The NIH study is the latest of more than 50 similar studies, which together should suggest that low carb diets are better than low fat diets for achieving weight loss and controlling type 2 diabetes. As a body of evidence is far from conclusive, but inconsistent as any in the literature. The 2015 edition of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, they are revised every 5 years, makes no reference to any of this new research because the scientists who advise the committee, the most eminent and well-connected nutritionists in the country, neglected to include a discussion on it in the report. They're hiding the science from the general public. It is a gaping omission, inexplicable in scientific terms, but entirely explicable in terms of the politics of nutrition science. If you are seeking to protect your authority, why draw attention to evidence that seems to contradict the assertions on which that authority is founded? Allow a thread like that to be pulled and the great unraveling might begin. I mean, they're literally, the U.S. Dietary Guidelines are denying the evidence of their contradictory to their own thought process, funded by the government, that you are going to go to bed at night thinking that they are doing what's right for you. It's insane. Last December, the scientists responsible for the report received a humiliating rebuke from Congress, the report being the U.S. Dietary Guidelines that did not allow counter evidence to be looked at. And so Congress rebuked them, which passed a measure proposing a review of the way the advice informing the guidelines is compiled. It referred to questions about the scientific integrity of the process. The scientists reacted angrily, accusing the politicians of being enthralled to the meat and dairy industries. Given how many of the scientists depend on research funding from food and pharmaceutical companies, this could be characterized as audacious. Some scientists agree with the politicians. David McCarran, a research association at the University of California, Davis, told the Washington Post, there was a lot of stuff in the guidelines that was right 40 years ago, but it has been disproved now. Unfortunately, sometimes the scientific community doesn't like to backtrack. You think? Stephen Neeson, chairman of the cardiovascular medicine at Cleveland Clinic, was blunter, calling the new guidelines an evidence-free zone. So remember, the new dietary guidelines, which are revised every 5 years in 2015, they don't take counter evidence about what studies have shown from the NIH, National Institute of Health. Now, it's a quackery guy, and the chairman of cardiovascular medicine at the Cleveland Clinic says the new U.S. guidelines from 2015 are evidence-free zone. It'll be interesting to see what they say in 2020. The congressional review has come about partly because of Nina Teicholz. Since her book was published in 2014, she has become an advocate for better dietary guidelines. She is on the board of the Nutrition Coalition, a body funded by philanthropists John and Laura Arnold, the stated purpose of which is to help ensure that nutritional policy is grounded in good science, which absolutely is not now. In September last year, she wrote an article for the BMJ, formerly the British Medical Journal, which makes the case for the inadequacy of scientific advice that underpins the dietary guidelines. The response of the nutrition establishment was ferocious. 173 scientists, some of whom were on the advisory panel and many of whose work had been criticized in Teicholz's book, signed a letter to the BMJ, formerly the British Medical Journal, again, demanding it retract the piece. Publishing a rejoinder to an article is one thing, requesting its erasure is another, conventionally reserved for cases involving fraudulent data. As a consultant oncologist for the NHS, National Health Service, in UK, Santhanam Sundar pointed out in response to the letter on the BMJ website, scientific discussion helps to advance scientists. Calls for retraction, particularly from those in eminent positions, are unscientific and frankly disturbing. The response of the nutrition authorities, 173 scientists, my friends, wanted not just a letter to be sent or retracted, but they want it erased as if it didn't exist. Stalinistic. And a consultant oncologist for the NHS, National Health Services, says calls for retraction, erasure particularly from those in eminent positions, are unscientific and frankly disturbing, especially the fact there is no evidence whatsoever of fraudulent data being used to write the article. The letter, which calls for its erasure, lists 10 errors on which on close reading turn out to range from trivial to entirely specious. I spoke to several of the scientists who signed the letter. This is Ian Leslie now. They were happy to condemn the article in general terms, but when I asked them to name just one of the supposed errors in it, not one of them was able to. One admitted that he hadn't read the article that Nina had written, but he condemned it and wanted not just retracted, but erased. Another told me she had signed the letter because the BMJ would not have published an article that was not peer-reviewed. But it was peer-reviewed. So one lady's saying she signed it because the BMJ shouldn't publish articles that aren't peer-reviewed. But the article was peer-reviewed. Another said they shouldn't sign it because it had all the errors in it. And then he admitted, but he didn't read it at all. What the hell? Meyer of Stanford, a Harvard epidemiologist, asserted that Teichel's work is riddled with errors. But he declined to discuss them with Ian Leslie, the guy who writes this article for The Guardian. Reticent as they were to discuss the substance of the piece, the scientists were noticeably keener to comment on his author, said the author. They did not want to discuss the errors, but they wanted to tackle Nina as a person. I was frequently, insistently reminded that Teicholz is a journalist and not a scientist, and that she had a book to sell, as if this settled the argument. David Katz of Yale, one of the members of the advisory panel and an indefatigable defender of the orthodoxies, told me that Teicholz's work reeks of conflict of interest. Of course, he did not specify, old David Katz of Yale, that he is the author of 4 of his own diet books. Dr. Katz does not pretend that his field has been right on everything. He admitted to changing his own mind, for example, on dietary cholesterol. I guarantee only after it is okay to do so. But he returned again and again to the subject of Teicholz's character. Nina is shockingly unprofessional, he says. I've been in rooms filled with who's who of nutrition. I've never seen such a unanimous revulsion as when Nina Teicholz's name comes up. She's an animal unlike anything I've seen before. Despite requests, he has cited no examples of her unprofessional behavior. This is what pisses me off. The vitriol poured over Teicholz is rarely dispensed to Gary Taubes, though they make this fundamentally similar arguments. This is what I want to talk about real quick. This is just me. There's a lady named Judith Curry, who is a climatologist, literally wrote the book on thermodynamics, ocean thermodynamics, and she was at Georgia Tech. She's a skeptic of global warming. All right, let's just put it that way. There are men skeptics of global warming. But Judith is the only one accused of sleeping her way of literally whoring herself to the top. No one else is except for her, literally of being a whore to get ahead in science. The men skeptics aren't told that. They're just said they're in thralls of whatever, big oil. I just find it, and these are not just crazy people on Twitter. These are Michael Mann, the hockey stick guy. His accolades on professional college campuses doing climatology research, saying that Judith Curry, just solely because she disagrees with them, is slutting herself and whoring herself. I find that incredibly despicable. And these guys should be ashamed of themselves. They should be held a distance from polite society, but they're not. They're put out there for all to see. It's disgusting. The same thing here. This guy, Dr. Katz from Yale, friggin' loser, says, Nina is an animal unlike anything I've ever seen before. Yet, what does he say about Gary Taubes? I guarantee he doesn't say that. Friggin' scumbag, man. Nina's a daughter. She's a mom. She's a sister of somebody. She's a colleague. You might not agree with her. But to call her that kind of stuff is misogyny in its worst. And these people are scumbags. It just makes me mad. And I have 2 daughters too. The idea that if they didn't toe the line from what old Dr. Katz, his misogyny, they'd be called an animal like they've never seen before, or that they're slutting or whoring themselves to get ahead. Freaking scumbags. I hate them. I don't hate them. I hate that stuff. I highly disrespect and despise these people for that. I don't hate them because I believe in Jesus. And man, he tells you not to hate, but man, it's hard. In March this year, this is 2016, Teicholz was invited to participate in a panel discussion on nutrition science at the National Food Policy Conference in Washington, D.C., only to be promptly disinvited after her fellow panelists made it clear they would not share a platform with her, i.e. deplatforming. And we're seeing this all over college campuses. The organizer replaced her with a CEO of the Alliance for Potato Research and Education. One of the scientists who called for the retraction of Nina Teicholz's BMJ article, who requested our conversation be off the record, complained that the rise of social media has created a problem with authority for nutrition science. Any voice, however mad, can gain ground, he told me. It's a familiar complaint, says Ian Leslie. By opening the gates of publishing to all, the internet has flattened hierarchies everywhere they exist. We no longer live in a world in which elites of accredited experts are able to dominate conversations about complex or contested matters. Thank the good Lord. Politicians cannot rely on the aura of office to persuade. Newspapers struggle to assert the superior integrity of their stories. Fake news. It is not clear that this change is overall a boon for the public realm, but in areas whose experts have a track record of getting it wrong, climate change, nutrition science, simple things like just washing your hands before you do surgery, i.e. Ignaz Semmelweis from the 1850s. It is hard to see how it could be worse. If there's ever a case that information democracy, even a very messy one, is preferable to an information oligarchy, the history of nutrition advice is it. At least we're open up to a different point of view, which might save your life. In the past, we only had two sources of nutritional authority, our doctor and government officials. It was a system that worked well as long as the doctors and the officials were informed by good science. But what happens if that cannot be relied on? Well, we're seeing the obesity epidemic. The nutritional establishment has proved itself skilled at ad hominem takedowns. But it's harder for them to do to Robert Lustig or Nina Teicholz what they did to John Yudkin. Harder, too, to deflect or smother the charge that the promotion of low-fat diets was a 40-year-old fad with disastrous outcomes, conceived, authorized, and policed by nutritionists politically engaged. Professor Yudkin retired from his post at Queen Elizabeth College in 1971 to write Pure, White, and Deadly. The college reneged on a promise to allow him to continue to use its research facilities. It hired a fully committed supporter of the fat hypothesis to replace him. And it was no longer deemed politic to have a prominent opponent of it on the premise. The man who had built the college's nutrition department from scratch was forced to ask for a lawyer, to intervene. Eventually, a small room in a separate building was found for Yudkin. When I asked Lustig why he was the first researcher in years to focus on the dangers of sugar, he answered, John Yudkin. They took him down so severely that no one wanted to attempt it on his own. Ian Leslie, the author of Curious, The Desire to Know and Why Your Future Depend on It. And I'm going to read that book. I just got it because I'm sure if he's writing for The Guardian, he's a man of the left, and I'm not, but the old left, man, critical thought, questioning authority, that used to be part and parcel for being on the left. And now it's not. It's just not. It's sad. Now, I printed this off in 2016, October. The article was written in April 2016. It had 2,270 comments at that time, my friends. Almost 3,000 comments. I want to see how many comments it has now. So I'll post a link in the show notes. It breaks your heart how many children are obese. It just breaks your heart how many children have lost their parents, their brothers, because of bad research by politicians, scientists engaging in politics. You got to be skeptical. Everything you hear, you've got to be skeptical. Everything you hear, you've got to challenge. Please, for the love of the good Lord, don't get your info from headline propaganda. I'm telling you, the biggest propagandists are headline writers. We know that for a fact. Open up your eyes, be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out, to quote somebody. I don't know who said that, Mark Twain or something like that. Einstein, I think it was Einstein who said that. Be open-minded, but challenge orthodoxy everywhere you see it. Because your life is at stake, and your life is, you only get one. And if you just follow along with the orthodox, the proponents who get rich off this say, you could be risking it, as we've seen now with the sugar conspiracy. All right, as always, if you like what you hear, subscribe. 5-star ratings are always appreciated. The YouTube channel is go to just YouTube.com/Heritage Wealth Planning. You can always go to the blog at heritagewealthplanning.com, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.